What are employers looking for? Collaborative problem solving, creative thinking, interpersonal conflict management, self-awareness, empathy, and really navigating uncertainty and being adaptable and able to figure stuff out. Like, to me, that sort of learning to learn set of competencies is like the Shangri-La, especially for this world, you mentioned tech, of generative AI. And you can't really be coasting along and develop those competencies.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari, and today's guest is someone whose work sits at the intersection of research, policy, and real-world change in education. Rebecca Winthrop is a global leader in rethinking how education systems can better serve students, not just in the US and Canada, but across the globe. As the director for the Center of Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, her work focuses on ensuring that every child has the opportunity to thrive, not just academically, but as engaged citizens in a rapidly evolving world. Rebecca is a trusted advisor to both school communities and national and international organizations. Her expertise is sought out by many, including parent networks, schools, district education leaders, the White House, the United Nations, and even Fortune 500 companies. Rebecca's work is centered on developing and advocating for evidence-based strategies that bring people together, families, educators, policymakers, and companies, to help children maximize their potential. Rebecca's studies and career have taken her from rural Oregon, where she grew up in a household shaped by activism and service, to working on women's rights for women refugees in South America, where she learned that education was essentially the enabler of fundamental human rights. From there, she spent decades researching and championing ideas that bring families, educators, and policymakers together to rethink how we engage students and create a strong public education system. I don't think I really have to go any further here in describing the kind of person Rebecca obviously is. She fits right in with the amazing guests that join us every week on Education Matters. But in today's conversation, we discuss her latest book, The Disengaged Teen, co-authored with journalist Jenny Anderson. It's a fascinating exploration of why so many students feel disconnected from school and what we as educators, parents, and leaders can do about it. We dive deep into the 4 modes of student engagement she and Jenny identify: passenger, achiever, resistor, and explorer mode, and how recognizing these patterns can transform the way we support students. Their focus on engagement, or the lack thereof, is nothing new to those of us in education. However, examining it through these modes offers some valuable insight, particularly in recognizing that all of us, adults included, embody each of these modes at different times, constantly shifting between them. And as we learn, the key then is to remain in explorer mode for as long as possible. In our conversation, we also explore the broader shifts happening in education, from the role of AI and technology to the importance of student agency. And for those of you working in leadership roles, we discuss what system-level changes are needed to move education beyond its industrial-era design and into a model that actually meets the needs of today's learners. If you're an educator, administrator, policymaker, or parent trying to understand what's happening in your teen's experience of school, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. And now, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Rebecca Winthrop. Rebecca Winthrop, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
Hi, Jason. It's wonderful to be here. I'm in my home in Washington, D.C.
DC. I took the family to DC recently. They loved it.
Did they? What'd you guys do? Visit museums?
Museums and really just toured the museum that is the city itself. Lots of walking,
Yes.
lots of American history.
It's a fun. It's a lovely city to walk around and live in, and you're always up close to the action of national politics for what it's for better or for worse.
Better for worse. When we were there, we had, forgive me, Canadians don't know all their American military vehicles, but we had Biden's 2 choppers fly over us, and my son was just loving it. But before we digress too far, I would have given you a proper introduction at this point, but can you describe your current role and what you're up to for the audience?
Sure. I run something at the Brookings Institution called the Center for Universal Education. And the Brookings Institution is a think tank, which is somewhat like a university with no students, and decision makers and practitioners are your students. That's one way to think about it. We do research and are incentivized to ensure that that research is useful, practical, grabbable, actionable by people who are on the ground able to use it. And of course, we do a fair bit of behind the scenes advising and supporting to make sure anybody who wants it, needs it, can get our advice and guidance on how to take those research-based recommendations and put them into practice.
Well, I certainly need it, and I think my audience would appreciate it as well. But before we get there, I always start the podcast with a little bit of biography. This just might be my own personal obsessions, understanding where people came from and how they got to where they are. So can you describe for us where did you grow up and what that was like?
Yes. I had a wonderful childhood. I was lucky. I have born into a wonderful family, parents who are ex-hippies who we lived in rural Oregon, and they worked with Native Americans, and I lived in a small little town, and we had lots of nature, lots of bears, lots of cougars, lots of rattlesnakes, as anybody who lives in a small town in Canada can appreciate, and lots of freedom.
Amazing. So with that freedom, how did you play as a child?
I mean, most of the time we were outside. We had actually a very small house that was hysterically, we found out because the people who built it their family came to visit after we moved in, was built by someone who built stage sets for theater. And so it was like a stage set, our little tiny house. It was like I don't think there was anything in it that was to code. And the ceiling was like high on one side and low in the middle. And then there were certain parts of the house where you could put your back against the wall and your feet against the other side of the wall and crawl all the way up to the top because the hallways were so narrow. So it was pretty hilarious. I'm not sure my parents loved it, but we as kids thought it was hilarious and fun. And most of the time we we just went outside and roved around the outdoors.
Is there anything about that upbringing you wish kids today had?
I'm sure plenty of kids still have that upbringing if you live in a small rural town. I live in Washington, D.C., and I never considered myself a city person. I just somehow miraculously ended up here. It was not my life plan. I didn't really have a life plan. So, that's probably how I ended up here. I do love the city, but I really wish that my boys who I'm raising here had the sort of freedom to just go out and explore wherever their, feet may take them. We had woods that backed up against our house. We had rivers. There was, tons of hiking. We had big parks. We could walk downtown. We would walk to our friend's house. And they, they're older now, so they are independent and get around, but we certainly monitor much more closely for physical safety, their whereabouts and want to know what's going on. And it's not like my parents didn't give us a bedtime and we didn't have to be back at home, which of course we did. But I do think that sense of possibility, I think there's something, how do I phrase it? Something in having the agency and autonomy to step out your door and take your little feet and go wherever you want. Of course, within some broad guidelines, I wasn't about to walk to another town, which by the way, I couldn't have, it was miles and miles away, and not tell them, but there was there were no cell phones, no Apple Watches, no nothing. You were on your own and you knew you had to, you had an actual watch and you had to be back at 6 for dinner time. And that was that.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth there with agency. And I know that's a big part of your work and we'll come back to that. But maybe before we get there, what do you remember first loving to learn?
I Very first loving to learn, and I remember this as a small young kid, I just loved to dance. I love to dance. I love music. I did dance. I did several extracurriculars throughout school, but dance was my first sort of love, and I was very invested, and it was a big part of my life growing up.
That's fantastic, and there's something to that. I think kinetic learning, right? Like for me, it was sports, and it was always that my full body was engaged. I'm sure it's the same with dance, although
What was your? Is that what you when you the question for you, Jason? What did you first remember first loving to learn? Was it playing sports?
yeah, sports and stories. I just remember loving stories.
Right, books,
But certainly the
reading.
most instinctive thing for me was sports.
Ah, what did you
And I wish I
play?
can dance. My wife is a wonderful dancer, and I just step on her feet all the time. But I could see why it's why everyone loves it. Is your entire body is committed to
Yeah,
it, right?
and music. I think
And music,
I think music was a big part of what. Every time I hear music, I want to dance to it. So
beautiful. So tell me about your formal education. What was that like in Oregon in the time that you grew up?
yeah, well, my little town had a state college in it, so it had one of the Oregon sort of campuses, community college, and then 4-year university, et cetera, amongst other things. And so school was really important for the people in my town. And I say that because a lot of the neighboring towns didn't ran out of money mid often towards the end of the school year and would shut down, literally. Like friends who were I did dance with who were in like neighboring towns, their school would close 2-3 months early regularly because the town ran out of money. And my little town always passed a referendum, extra taxes to keep the school open. So education was really important for our little town, I would say, for my family, certainly. And it was, very, that we had a couple of elementary schools, and then we had one middle school and one high school. Like there was, it's not like you need to talk about school choice that much. I guess people could homeschool. I might have known a couple people who did that, but basically you just went to the school in your neighborhood, and you went to the middle school and high school. Now it was, I think, pretty good. I don't, to be honest, remember a huge amount of it. I do remember my extracurriculars, and I do
Hmm.
remember a few amazing teachers that really inspired me. And I remember a teacher in middle school who was our social studies teacher, who was amazing, and he would throw a hacky sack at you if he thought you were spacing out, which I don't think you're allowed to do anymore, but it really kept us on our toes. And again, and also an incredible social studies teacher, Mr. Gabriel, in my high school, who, was dynamic and interesting and fun and talked about all this big stuff in the rest of the world and history. And it was, mind expanding, and got me really excited about seeing the world.
So, what was it that like most impacted how you think and what you went on to study at university?
I think those are two different questions. So, what impacted most what I went on to study in university was definitely Mr. Gabriel and social studies, as well as my debate coach. So I did debate, and that to me was also really vibrant memories. Also, talking about learning to think. That was, I think, one of the best trainings I had, one of the best ways, one of the best preparations, really, for higher education, where it was debate team, where we had to, team up and make arguments based on the questions presented, and we had to find evidence, and then we had to do it for both sides, and you'd have to sort of perspective take and figure out how to craft an argument, how to look at holes in other people's arguments. And those two, Mr. Treadway, who led debate, and Mr. Gabriel, were really big influences on me. So I think that I went on and I studied political science, and I took a global, was really interested in looking globally around the world on issues. So I think they had a pretty big influence.
Yeah, that one of the minor tragedies of my life is that I didn't study political science more. I loved it, but you can only pick so many subjects.
You can still do it, Jason.
Well, no,
lifelong learning.
I still do it, and of course I did come at it through my degree in philosophy, which was super interesting. But it's just something about spending all that time just understanding politics, the history of politics.
Well, my graduate work, Jason, was philosophy. I did a PhD in education, yes, at Teachers College, but it was actually a philosophy degree.
Okay, excellent. So you just jumped my next question, which was, how did you find your way into education? And now with the caveat or the additional question of, how did you use philosophy to study education?
Yes. So I worked after I graduated from college. I had a professor who had a colleague who worked at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And that's my first job out of college, was working for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And to say it was a job is generous. It was an internship. And I worked in Central America. And there was, I have a couple of stories I tell because it was an evolution to get to education, but I will spare you all of them and tell this one, which is I was really seized of the injustice in the world around human rights. And particularly, I was really worried about women's rights globally. I had, probably remember reading about cases in India where women are raped and they report it and then are thrown in jail rather than the victims are prosecuted. So I was very passionate about that problem. And so the project I was working on in UNHCR was around, in Central America, helping develop legislation to protect women who are victims of domestic violence, especially in refugee contexts. And again, I was an intern. I was the bottom of the bottom. And so I was, I remember sort of looking at all the feedback from focus groups and with women refugees who were saying, this is great, this search to change the law. And they were incredibly savvy. And they said, but, that's going to take a while to change the law. And then once you change the legal statute, you're going to have to train the police, and that's going to take a while. And what about my life today? These are all women who are suffering quite severely from domestic violence today. And they said, what I really want is to learn to read. I want to learn to read so I can go to the clinic by myself and not go with a husband or some other male family member and talk honestly about what's happening to me. I want to learn to read so I can go to the market and start a little business and get some of my own money so I can be free and have autonomy and leave the really difficult situation I'm in. And that was like really a turning point on a longer journey of coming to how important education is. I had never thought about how small your world is if you're not literate. And really began to see education as sort of a fundamental enabler of human rights.
Wonderful. So this really does. This is why I love biography, because this just put into context your work, which is so fascinating. And I really wish we could do like a 4-hour right now, but I don't think it's the time. Maybe we'll do a part 2 at one point, because
there we go.
yeah, your research and work up into the book that we're here to discuss, the Disengaged Teen, that you wrote with your colleague Jenny Anderson. I do want to dive into that because I think so many people in this audience, from superintendents to principals, teachers, and then even a lot of parents, which I usually don't recommend to listen to podcasts. It's more geeking out around education, but I do want to send them this because as reading the book, I've been fascinated. But before we get there, you've just done so much work globally, and I can see where that influence came from now. And hopefully we can come to that. But why don't we start with the Disengaged Teen, and tell us about why you wrote the book, why I've heard you in other podcasts, hounded Jenny to be your co-author.
I did. I pursued her heavily.
Yeah, and what the reason was for this particular focus.
Sure. So I had been doing research and peer learning work on the role of family school collaboration and family school engagement for several years. And I had come to that research because I had done prior to that research on education innovations and thinking about what are the good types of innovations we really want in order to move the needle to have a breadth of skills so kids can thrive, or a holistic educational experience. And one of the gaps that I saw in that research was a real inattention to families and communities as partners in the education transformation, education reform process. And the more I learned and read about system transformation, which sustainably shifting systems, you have to bring in the demand side of education. So communities' voices, families' voices, students' voices. Otherwise, your education reform probably won't last. It'll probably revert to the mean. So I had founded the global, our Family Engagement and Education Network, which is this global network of now, at the time it was 10, now it's about 16 countries. So not all national. A lot of the partners are government partners or civil society partners in certain jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions, and the partners they work with to really look at this question together. And we were in the midst of that and had put out a lot of interesting research on how to better work with families and peers. And then COVID hit. Families and schools, I should say, and then COVID hit. And I had a personal experience, which was I had two boys. One was in third grade, one was in sixth grade. And the one who was in sixth grade, I thought I wasn't going to have to worry about it all because he had always brought home top marks, straight A's, top grades, happy to go to school. And I thought, oh, he'll be fine. He's super engaged. And I'm really worried about my little guy who was in third grade, who had basically stopped trying altogether to learn, had internalized this idea that he was stupid because we just found out right before COVID, he was dyslexic, had ADHD, and was a bit of a, that was what he was struggling with. And I thought, he's disengaged. I'm really going to have to lean in. It turned out to be the exact opposite. My older one, the minute in the US, we went to home-based school, so they're doing it online, and it was not graded. It was pass-fail. And he lost all motivation. I couldn't get him to do anything. It was actually really bad. He wouldn't get out of bed. And he said, Mom, if it's not counted, it doesn't matter. And I realized he was really just pursuing the grade, not invested and engaged in the learning. And my little one, when he was freed from keeping up with his peers in a classroom, he blossomed in COVID. He was engaged. He just needed a different learning environment. He was independent. He got up all by himself and made a little plan. And he caught up multiple grade levels. We got him special, tutoring for dyslexia, et cetera. So, and I realized that if I can't tell as a parent with a lot of education expertise how engaged my kids are based on the feedback loops I get from my kids' school, which is largely grades and a couple meetings a year with the teacher around largely compliance. Are they a problem in school or are they not a problem? How is any other parent going to tell how engaged their kid is? And I just knew from all the research how important engagement is, and grades really tell half the story. So that was a big motivator to see how can we help families and, frankly, educators themselves in the classroom, along with ed leaders, better see in student engagement. Make something that is actually kind of hard to see, but more visible.
So, I mean, we were discussing before we jumped on here how the idea and the notion and understanding of lack of engagement isn't really that new. Like, I mean, just personal experience. I'm sure a lot of the listeners are thinking back to their days in the class. And we talk a lot about still today how the structure and environment of classrooms haven't changed that much, although I think they've changed more than we kind of give them credit for. But we remember back when we were younger and how disengaged we were. And intuitively, we know that's a problem. But I think one of the things that you and Jenny did really well is identify these modes of engagement. I think they're really useful for the audience. Can you describe the modes of engagement? And I'm very interested in how you came up with these 4.
Sure. So we came up with 4 modes of engagement to help educators and families see how engaged their kids are, because we found from the research that adults, teachers, school leaders, parents, are really good at spotting one dimension of engagement, which is behavioral engagement. What kids do. Do they go to school? Do they do their homework? Do they not disrupt class? Do they follow instructions? All of which are good things. But there's a whole lot of other components of student engagement that make it the powerful thing that it is, which includes emotional engagement. Are kids interested in what they're learning? Are they enjoying the schooling experience? Do they feel they belong? Do they have friends? Do they find the learning relevant to their daily lives? Questions like that. That's the second dimension. Another dimension is cognitive engagement. Are kids actually deploying deeper learning strategies?
With you, yeah.
Yeah, connecting what they're learning in one subject to maybe something in another subject or something at home. Are they deploying self-regulated learning strategies? If it gets really hard, do they take a deep breath, persist, try again, right? Like the really cognitive engagement. And then a fourth dimension is agentic engagement, which people we found rarely talk about, but is very well substantiated in the research. Particularly, I think it might be that the lead researchers are in Australia. So it's not, I don't know. Anyways, why it's not more part of the conversation. So agentic engagement is our kids being proactive over what they're doing in their learning environment. It literally is, are they proactively influencing the flow of instruction to help them learn better, to do things that are more interesting to them, to get the support they need? Are they making suggestions? Hey, can I work with a partner? Oh, this is an interesting essay. I want to do my topic on this. Is that okay? Like, are they, whatever their learning environment is, are they able to take initiative to make their experience better? And those 4 dimensions are all in the academic literature. However, super wonky, super hard to be in a classroom instructing and think about a four-part matrix of each kid. Super hard for a parent to even figure out, are they cognitively engaged? Are they not? And so one of the things that we did is, through our research, and I'm happy to talk about the methods later, qualitative and quantitative, we, really found that there are engagement profiles that exist in the literature, and we sort of leaned into that, and we found kids really show up to their learning and engagement in these 4 modes. One is passenger mode. These are the kids who are behaviorally engaged, not engaged on any other dimension. They might be emotionally engaged in terms of friends, but not emotionally engaged in learning. So they might like to go to school to see their friends. But they are coasting, doing the bare minimum. They've basically showed up to school but dropped out of learning. Then you've got kids who are in achiever mode. These are kids who are behaviorally engaged, they could be emotionally engaged, like really excited to be doing the work and finding it important. And certainly they're cognitively engaged, not really agentically engaged so much. They're much more of a getting really good at following instructions. So we found actually that you've got kids in happy and unhappy achiever mode. And we can come back to that, Jason. But the upshot is oftentimes kids in achiever mode are very fragile learners. They are risk averse. They don't want to do anything that might upset the apple cart of not getting a perfect score or good grade. And often are not used to failing and picking themselves back up again. Then you've got kids in resistor mode. They are disengaged on all fronts, and they are the kids who we all dub, collectively we, society, dub the problem children. They are avoiding or disrupting their learning. They're the class clowns who, or, and it's a continuum. It can be a slow process. Class clown to not turning in homework, to skipping a class because it's boring, to skipping school, to chronic absenteeism, school refusal, perhaps even leaving school altogether. And those kids actually have a fair bit of agency or gumption because it's just pointed away from their learning. They are actually influencing the flow of instruction, just not constructively towards their learning. And we found that actually, if you can harness that agency in these kids who are sort of spending a lot of time in resistor mode, they can flip pretty quickly, even quicker than kids in passenger and achiever mode, into explorer mode. And that's the mode we want most kids to spend a lot of time in, or I should say, all kids to spend most of their time in. And this is where they're engaged on all fronts, including agentically engaged, where they are taking initiative, being proactive. It's the kid who takes a science class and the teacher talks about extreme weather, and then they come home and a parent says, "So how was your day?" And they, instead of saying fine, good, okay, boring, they start talking about tornadoes. They got to see, excited about tornadoes, and they start doing research online about tornadoes. And then they start talking at the dinner table all about tornadoes. Like, they are agentically engaged.
Well, one of the things I love about the modes of engagement is they're not rigid. And I think it's important for people to understand that really there's a lot of nuance, because as you were describing them in the book, and the majority of the book is describing them and understanding how to navigate through them and around them and identify them. Parents right now are probably hearing their kids in multiple stages. So can you kind of talk about how they're not these rigid categories, but how they work?
Yeah. Jenny and I are very, very clear and try to be very explicit on every podcast we go on that these are not meant to be labels of kids or to pigeonhole kids. And she and I talked a lot about the possible risks of even putting the modes out there being misused. And so we figured, actually they are really needed, but we just need to emphasize. So thank you for underlining that they are modes. That's why they're called modes. Kids move in and out of them.
They're not categories, right?
They're not categories, they're modes.
Yeah.
And kids move in and out of them in the course of a day, maybe a course of a week, or it could be they're in one mode in school, one mode out of school. So we have a character in the book that we use, Stella, to illustrate. She was in a different mode in each class and then outside of school. So the problem is, and actually we think that it is not necessarily a bad thing to switch between modes, because there are moments in time when you're going to want to be a passenger a a little bit.
For your mental health, I just got to coast through this course.
You do. I mean, I've got
experience.
a 60, and by the way, guess what? We do it too.
100%.
Like, I do not, and I coach my team member. I have a big team. We've got 80 people around the globe, but particularly the young professionals that I hire, I coach them to be like, hey, you cannot be 100% on every task that I give you because it's too much. So you're going to have to, give 100% on some. You're going to have to figure out what you can do. That's all you need to do is the bare minimum, tick the box, right? This, the memo that needs to go in for the, finance receipts. It doesn't have to be formatted perfectly. You just got to get it in, right?
Your expenses don't need to be.
It's fine. Don't worry. Like
Just
passenger mode. Just get it done.
Yeah.
Do the bare minimum. The event with the Minister of Education. Now that one I want you to full on, right?
Yeah.
So same with students. So there'll be times when they need to just get through it. There'll be times when we really want them to buckle down and be in achiever mode. My son, 16-year-old son, which is when you can get your driver's license here. He had to get his learner's permit, was like, I want to get it. And I was like, get to achiever mode. I'm not going to make the appointment and drive all the way down to the Department of Motor Vehicles if you didn't study, and it's not going to be interesting, but you're going to have to learn it, And there's times when resistor mode is relevant. There's stuff that happens, and we want kids to raise their voice and say, no, this is not happening. It could be bullying. It could be, problems with
John Lewis
also,
11.
Good trouble, right?
Good trouble.
There is times when you're going to have to be in resistor mode. The issue that we worry about most, and we saw the damage it does, is when kids get stuck in either passenger, achiever, resistor mode, and it stops being a mode that they deploy at the moment, and it starts being an identity. Like, I am a passenger. I don't care about school. I don't give effort. That's who I am.
I'm not a math person.
I'm not a math
I'm not
person.
a language person.
Or I'm bad at school. The one more often, I'm bad at school.
Right.
I'm not good. Right. I can't learn. Right.
Opting into the whole thing.
Yeah. And interestingly, we found a lot of problems too with kids who are stuck in achiever mode. Now they might make it through school fine, but a lot of them tipped into unhappy achiever mode, where they were really tying their self-worth with achieving in school. So if I don't get a good grade, I am therefore an unworthy bad person, rather than I didn't do so well in that class next time or test or whatever. And not really building the muscles, as I said, to productively struggle, which we all need to build in this world. And a lot of those kids had pretty bad mental health problems.
Right. And all of that also seems to be just completely disjointed with what we need going forward, not only in terms of skills, but behaviors and, the approach to creating like a civic capitalism, right? Like we like, and maybe we'll come back to plant the flag here, because I do want to kind of talk about this idea, but it almost feels like that explore mode is more welcome in like tech spheres, where you're encouraged to fail fast, but just keep working and working hard and engage in the project.
Yeah.
So before we actually go there, can we spend a little bit more time talking about, I found something very fascinating at the beginning of the book about the root cause of disengagement. And it lines up really with what my first brief episode was about, is the narrative of education, the raison d'etre, the why. Can you talk a little bit about that and any of your findings and research?
Are you talking about sort of the frame that we developed, which we did see around the age of achievement to the age of agency? Is that the piece? Or
yeah, so it's around the idea that a third of students are engaged, and you connected it to essentially it's my language I use, like they don't have we don't provide students with a strong narrative as to why they're in school.
Yeah, the relevance piece. Okay, so first off, which is a question you posed but we didn't get into, and people often ask this. Kids have been disengaged, and again, the book is heavily centered on U.S. data, but I think this applies across, have been heavily disengaged for a long time. So it's not a new phenomena. So I looked at, the U.S. Census has a set of parent questions. that ask, are basically engagement questions, which is, do your kids do their homework on their own? Do they love going to school? Do you need to prompt them, never, often, whatever? And that hasn't really changed that much. It's gone down a bit. It's gone down a bit in recent years, particularly with COVID, but it's basically been, a third of kids in the last 2 decades are highly engaged in school. The issue is that what we require of kids, what we ask of kids, what the world needs kids to be able to do to thrive in work, life, citizenship, and I would say higher education, is changed so much. And so the costs of being disengaged in school are much higher now. It used to be, several decades ago, that the number one thing employers were looking for was strong literacy and math skills. And you could kind of coast through school and get those and you'd be okay. Today, what are employers looking for? Collaborative problem solving, creative thinking, interpersonal conflict management, self-awareness, empathy, all sorts of things. And really, really navigating uncertainty and being adaptable and able to figure stuff out. Like, to me, that sort of learning to learn set of competencies is like the Shangri-La, especially for this world you mentioned, tech, of generative AI. And you can't really be coasting along and develop those competencies. So that is sort of the landscape. Now, you talked about, why is it? I think kids have been disengaged for a long time and continue to be disengaged because they don't see a lot of relevance to what they're learning in school, to what's happening in the outside world. And it's been that way for quite some time. We did this large, we partnered at Brookings with the nonprofit Transcend, and we did a large survey of over 65,000 students. And a third of, 30% of 10th graders say they see relevance in what they're learning. Only 1 out of 3. We also had only 1 out of 3 10th graders say they had an opportunity to develop their own ideas in school. So, it's relevance, it's autonomy, it's choice at a time when, and you've talked about this, Jason, like at a time when adolescent development is seeking novelty, meaning making. This is the time when kids care about justice and what's happening in the world. They're just beginning to, open their eyes and want to literally engage in the world in a meaningful way. And we end up serving them a heavy dose of, in the US at least, basically content mastery, which is important and good. It's just not that exciting enough. They need a lot more opportunities for application of that knowledge.
So this would be a good time to talk about, I think it'll take us to, you have this fascinating idea that I love, that we're on the verge, or we're about to enter, or have entered into this age of agency, that I really like. And I think it's connected to, or I think you'll connect that, but maybe I shouldn't put words in your mouth, to my question around, now, how do we continue to reform the system, our education systems? Let's just, like, I know you're familiar with Canada and some of the work in BC, but even use the US as a model. What are the things we can do? Because I also love, I've heard you many times champion teachers, and I love that, because there's so many times someone has an idea about the system, and this might come from people really outside education, often does, that they think the teachers are the problem. Like Bill Gates had that big study at you. Your eyes there for our listeners just got real big with that study that spent a lot of money trying to essentially, I don't want to say bribe, but entice teachers to be better teachers, and it didn't work because the teaching is a complex thing. It's not as easy as it seems from the outside. So I love how you champion teachers, but can you maybe describe what are the types of things that we can do to build more resilient. And I know by resilient, you often talk about flexible students.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Jenny and I are very clear that teachers are really stuck in the middle. They get pressure from above, and certainly the US context. We've got state standards, and they've got to make sure everyone's on grade level. And then they're pressured from below. They're pressured from families and parents who are like, do right by my kid, which is can be good. You want to advocate for your child, but is often done in a way that is pretty disrespectful. And are often in a hard spot. And this is not to us, this is not a teacher problem. This is a system problem. And there are things that teachers can do. So we basically talk through what can affect, if you're a parent or a caregiver, what can you do at home? If you're a teacher, what can you do in your classroom tomorrow, no matter who your school leader is? And if you're an education leader, what can you really do to think about shifting your system to make it put student engagement more at the center, make it more engaging? And you asked about teachers. So and we can talk about all three if you like, but starting with the teachers, the thing that we recommend is teachers can use a range of practices that have come out of 20 years of research on agentic engagement and autonomy supportive teaching that gives a little bit of space for kids to have more explore moments. And these are things that can be done regardless of whatever school they're in, whatever system. So they're things like explanatory rationales, which is basically explaining why you're doing something. Hey, we're assigning this. I'm assigning this piece of homework, not because it's due at the end of the week. That's not an explanatory rationale. Or I'm going to test you on it. That's not an explanatory rationale. But because I want you to see how authors weave, fictional narrative with historical fact, or whatever it is, that is explaining. Other examples include giving 2 to 3 options for homework. I want you to practice, give the explanatory rationale, this blah, blah, blah skill. This is why we're giving it. And you have 3 choices. That automatically makes students have to pause for a moment and reflect internally, what would I be more interested in? Which is a much different, more proactive stance around learning than I'm given this, I have to do it just because. Another thing is really perspective taking at the beginning of a lesson. So this one is so interesting. All of this work comes out of John Marshall Reeve and his many colleagues who've done this over the last 20 years. And it's one of the hardest ones, he says. When we interviewed him, it's literally just taking the kids' perspectives at the beginning of a lesson, which is, rather than showing up and saying, we're talking about the solar system today, you get out your pencils or, there's going to be interactive groups later, whatever. In which case kids are showing up ready to receive, they're on the back foot, show up and say, hey, we're talking about the solar system today. Before we dig in, does anybody have any questions about the solar system? Is there anything you're super curious about? Some teachers, go and write an empty Google search bar on the chalkboard or whatever, or project it, and kids, go up and write their questions. And the reason this one is hard is that when they do training with teachers and they start this practice, very simple, teachers report that it takes about 2 weeks before kids actually say anything. They are so conditioned in so many schools to not ask questions and just receive and not to be asked what they're curious about, that it takes about a month to reorient. And then there's a bunch of other little other practices, and taken in combination, it really can help kids get into explore mode. So it's not like you have to move to democratic schooling or nothing.
Mm-hmm. Before we move to advice for parents, because I do want to have a nice little section on that, because there's so much great practical advice in the book. I've heard you also speak about, that we have very committed educators, superintendents, but that we have a design problem in schools. And I took that to mean the design, a problem in the structural design of how we do everything, so to
Right.
speak.
How we organize the
How we
modern day
organize.
school.
Can you maybe give some insight to our superintendent colleagues that might be listening?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably all things they've thought about and heard before. But, the modern day organization of education systems, which looks oddly similar around the globe. So there's a lot of cross country transfer on models,
Mm.
does not align with the learning sciences. If it did, you would have had a lot of play in the early years, and then you absolutely need direct instruction alongside exploration. Kids have, there's core knowledge is essential, and I think it's going to be increasingly important in an age of AI. So we do not want to lose that. But then as kids get older, you would have more and more time, taking instruction and developing mastery and core knowledge and applying it outside in the world. And you would definitely not sort of silo your direct instruction into different subjects that were kind of, made up 100 years ago.
Right.
They're real
Right.
subjects, they're real disciplines. It's fine to be strong in your disciplinary expertise, but you wouldn't teach them siloed.
Right.
And there's no reason, like in the US, it's usually biology, chemistry, and physics. It's taught in that order, which makes no logical sense for learning, and is only taught in that order because 100 years ago, folks who designed education systems put it in alphabetical order: B, C, P. That was how they organized it. So there's the school, the fact, I could go on and on, but I think for school leaders, education leaders, my message would be, if you care about student attendance, chronic absenteeism, if you care about achievement, if you care about student mental health, if you care about college graduation rates, if you care about skill development to be good citizens, you have to care about student engagement. And too often we focus on so many other things and think student engagement's an extra nice to have, like a cherry on the top of the ice cream. And it really is the ice cream. Like the learning sciences shows, it is a moderator variable. The level of engagement anybody has, a young person has, whether it's on the sports field, at home, in a classroom, determines how much they're going to get out of that context, that teaching, that sort of instructional context. And we have to orient our work around engagement.
So the most engaged classes I've seen over the years have been some mixture, and usually both, like project-based learning and inquiry learning. The issue with those is that it's very different from how teachers were taught to teach, so to speak. And they can be very messy processes. In your research, and maybe in your own personal experience, do you have any suggestions for how we can start to just structure more of the teacher professional development or even the classrooms, the schedules around these modes that can really be kind of accelerators for engaged learners?
So, to get kids in explore modes, there are many, many ways to do it. They do not have to be in explore mode inside a math class. They can learn math in a math class and be in explore mode in other domains, other spaces. However, it would be great if core academic classes allowed for more explore moments. And there's the stuff that teachers can do individually in their classroom, but then there was lots of students we talked to who were in Resistor mode and moved to different environments, different schools, different programs within the same school, who all of a sudden blossomed into explore mode once they were given more autonomy and agency. And so, there's not one way to do it. I think project-based learning is excellent if done well, and it's not good if done poorly, because then kids don't actually even master core knowledge. So I think the following are, to me, the principles. One is anytime you can pair core knowledge development mastery with application. And, whether that's doing your work through a real life example, whether you're trying to work as a team to solve a problem. It could be, made up in the school or the classroom. It could be out, in the community partnering with, local groups. One of the characters in our book moved from a traditional public school, full on resistor mode, to a school called Iowa Big that was really, actually, you could attend your traditional public school. You could be on the football team or go to prom if you wanted part of the time. And then the other part of the time, you were working on projects that communities asked for help on. A bridge got washed out from a rainstorm. Students were trying to redesign and redesign the footpaths so it was more pedestrian friendly. That government, local civil society, and businesses brought to the students. And that was an incredible example. I think anything that can sort of use the community as classroom, again, if done well, can be incredibly powerful.
So just out of curiosity, you ever come across the book City as Classroom by Marshall Eric McLuhan and Linda Hutchin? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. It's because that's one of the models I've had
Yes.
from my university days that I thought was fantastic. And it does verge on that kind of inquiry and project-based learning, but way before I think those terms were really even being used in education. Okay. So can we now, that's really useful. So we talked a little bit about teachers, what, district admin can think about and can start doing. How about for parents? I don't want to summarize your work. I'll let you do. What are some of the best ways for parents to think about this?
Couple of messages for parents. One, you have a lot more power than you think, particularly because we ended up looking heavily at adolescents. And when it comes to student motivation and engagement, and we define student engagement as what kids do with their motivation, families, caregivers, parents have a really important, meaningful role right alongside peers and educators, teachers. So that's number one. How you interact with their kid matters on how motivated and engaged they are in school. Two, you can do a lot at home. And this is not about high financial resource expenditures on tutors or extracurriculars. It's literally how you interact with your kid at home. And we talk about the learning sciences and brain development, adolescent development, and really discussion is to adolescents what cuddles are to babies. It's how they learn and they grow. And so how we talk with our young people makes a big difference. And definitely balance the content of what they're learning with their performance in school. Often we are indexing on how they did. And it can really help to talk about what they're learning. Definitely go deep, not broad. You don't have to do a review at the dinner table of every single class and what they're learning. I wouldn't want to do that autopsy every day at the end of the day for all my meetings at work. I would be so bored with myself. But a couple of things. Oh my gosh, tell me what you're doing in science. Oh, that's so interesting, which is a third thing we do. You can connect what they're learning to the relevance in the real world. Because often they are missing that. What is it good for? How is it used? Which is why the sort of knowledge mastery paired with application is, I think, so important for many reasons, thinking reasons, skill development reasons, but also, just motivation and engagement around the relevance. Another thing we can do is, and this is perhaps one of the most important things, is model the thrill of learning ourselves. John Hattie, who everyone knows, and in his, he has an entire book out, which he did with his son, who's a teacher, by the way, for parents, which he basically makes the argument, based on his meta-analyses of meta-analyses, his massive data review, that parents should be kids first learners, not first
Mm.
teachers, which
Mm.
what he means by that is how parents model curiosity and the thrill of learning has a huge impact on interest, motivation, engagement, and hence performance. So those are things all parents can do at all times. And then we do have in the book, and we won't have time, I'm sure, to go through each one. There's specific things you can do to help a kid get unstuck if they're in resistor mode, passenger mode, or achiever mode.
Yeah, let's hop into that. But before we get that, I kind of want to emphasize that point for parents. Like, they don't have to be learners around like grade 5 social studies, right? Like the modeling,
No.
like they can model, like you like cars and you like learning about
Absolutely.
cars, you can model that. Because a lot of the advice in the book dovetails with what my parents were both educators have told me in raising my kids. Like, just show them that you're interesting, that you're interested in different things and that you get excited about learning about whatever, whether it be sports or cars or philosophy.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And curiosity is contagious. So, and so is incuriosity.
Right. And then one other point that I wanted to emphasize that I, again, dovetail with some of the great advice I've got. I always ask for advice from everybody, especially when my kids were born, was to, and this one wasn't, it wasn't apparent to me and probably should have been. Don't label your children.
Yeah.
Don't label them as this or that especially when they're very young. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So, we talk a lot about the role of adolescence is identity development. Our young people are trying to learn how to stand out to fit in. What is my unique contribution to my community? And we want to support that. And we want to ultimately treat them with respect, and most importantly, them feel they're being treated with respect, because we might feel we're treating them with respect. It doesn't mean there's no consequences. It means that we take genuine interest in their interests, even if they are not our interests. So, you might not love skateboarding, but if you've got a kid who loves skateboarding, lean into it. And far too often, and this is actually for ed leaders and parents and, parents, caregivers, and families, when we have a kid who seems to be struggling academically, we sort of, out of love and care and worry, red flags go up. We think of them as resistor, as problem children, rather children with problems. And we take away their extracurriculars, their enrichment. Schools do this all the time. Public schools often. You need to maintain your GPA in order to be part of chess club, model UN, do the cool field trip for the talented and gifted program, whatever, enriched, interesting learning experiences. And those experiences are actually exactly what kids need who are disengaging and disengaged. They need more autonomy and more respect to re-engage. And there's plenty of research around this broadly, but we found this in our qualitative research. A spark in something can keep those kids engaged and then ultimately spill over. One of the characters in the book we have was a huge resistor in school for a variety of reasons, but his parents never always disciplined him. Didn't do homework, skipped school, et cetera. They took away his bike and they didn't let him do this, but they never told him he was a bad kid. They always said, we know you do not seem to be doing what the system wants you to do, and we would like you to do it. It's important, and this is why. And they never took away the thing he loved most, which was architecture. They would encourage it. They would take him, even when he was, acting out at school and causing problems, they would take him to open houses to look at floor plans. They would have model CAD on his computer at home, and they would ask about they would barbecue on Sunday, and they would ask about his drawings and be really interested and say, look, honey, you could be an architect. Always having this potential future self helping him connect the dots with his future and what he could be and his potential. They did not say, you're a bad kid, you're a problem kid, I'm really disappointed with you. They did say, you shouldn't behave this way. This is not how I want you to, this is not my expectation. And he never ended up sinking into an identity of, I'm not a learner, I'm a bad kid. And eventually they moved him into a different school program that was much more hands-on, and he took off. And then he graduated with honors and got a full scholarship and triple major and co-designed a course his freshman year with his professor. Like, he just took off. So I think that is also really important for parents to have that in their mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful example, because I can't think of any kid that doesn't have a deep passion in something. And if they don't really identify it, maybe it's just, you just keep exposing them to things. Is that what you would say the process is?
I would say the process is notice their spark. As long as it's not hurting themselves and other people, that's the red line. Notice their spark, lean into it. We interviewed countless parents who were like, oh my gosh, my kid was so interested in weather and wants to be a meteorologist, but I didn't understand why for years he kept taking my phone and looking at the weather app. Thought he was just like, obsessed with, if I'm going to rain, I need an umbrella or something. So we're so busy as parents in the general flow, like, just notice what they're talking about, notice what they're interested in, notice what they're asking about, and lean into it, investigate, do it. If it's, video games, go play a video game with them, talk to them about it. I would not, tech is really hard. I would not say let them play video games 24/7 and not do anything else. But don't say you're rotting your brain, you're never going to amount to anything, this is terrible, you generation, or I don't know how you survive.
Well, we're kind of running up to time here, but let's dive into that question, because I think that's an important one with a lot of parents. I know, I mentioned to you, I have middle schoolers, and so it's something we're all struggling with.
Yeah.
What we did the other day is, the kids were coming out of Christmas break, where we allowed them a little bit more leeway on their phones. They're just old devices connected to the internet, but connected here at home where we can monitor. They can't take them out. And they got into habits of using a little bit more than my wife and I would have liked. But, they got frustrated when we were having the conversation. My daughter started crying, and I kind of just looked at them and said, like, we're really the first generation to ever have to figure this out. Let's figure it out. And just that changed the whole dynamic of the conversation. Do you have any tips? Because there is a section in the book, how tech intensifies disengagement. But I know you're not on the hate side of the kind of equation. That's like, it's the core main piece, social media. But
we have a whole chapter in the book, and really what we found is tech is a huge problem. It exacerbates disengagement, but it can also be very good if used to support more explorer moments. So it is very complicated. And there are some, again, there's a whole chapter on this, but there's a bunch of things we can do. There's some like house cleaning basics, which is make sure we are parents. Nobody is regulating this technology. The burden is on our shoulders, unfortunately. We have to regulate for our own kids, because we cannot expect them to put down Instagram and transition to something else. It is, the tech is so incredibly well designed with incredible brain scientists to keep you scrolling. Like, it's not a personal fault. So that's stance one. Stance two.
So would you suggest that we wait for social media as long as possible? That's kind of my stance. I have taken that from hate, and I think it makes a lot of sense.
I mean, I would just from the social comparisons data. That's what I do with my own kids. So, but I think the core sort of bright lines are: make sure tech doesn't take away from sleep, social interaction, exercise, time in nature, basics. And
Perfect.
Then I think the second sort of tip, so that's, major tip one, major tip two, is you need to bring your kid into the conversation. So again, agency, respect. Like you can say, look, I only want 30 minutes a day and this is why, A, B, C, D, and let's talk about it. And how do you want to do it? And, you can have a conversation with them. So that's incredibly important. Tip 3 is teach them the skills to moderate their tech, because they're going to need that when they graduate. I mean, I know there's this idea of like, well, let them on social media at 16. I've done that with my children. I did that. I did that because I saw all the research before. They had flip phones or Apple Watch, and now my 16-year-old has social media. He has no skills to self-moderate, even at 16, because it's really
So
not that much.
addictive.
It's not that much better. So
It's so addictive. You're right.
and so
Yeah.
I teach him, like, there's a bunch of exercises in the book about, self-reflection on, is it bringing you up or is it bringing you down? Is it replenishing you or making you feel worse? And I had a little parental victory. I remember hearing him talking with his friend a couple months ago, and he was like, man, I was on social media too long. I just feel like trash when I get stuck too long. I go past that tipping point. And his friend was like, yeah, me too, man. It's when I am on video games too long. Yeah, it just feels terrible. So I'm
Big
scaffolding,
mom win. Big mom win.
but
Researcher slash mom win there.
yes, but at least he's self-reflecting,
Yeah. Yeah. You gave
because
him the tools.
in a hot 2 years, he's out in college on his own.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he's going to have to learn to self-regulate.
I think that's super useful. Okay, I have a couple more questions. I think I told you at the onset, I can spend hours. I mean, I have a whole thing here that we'll have to leave for another time about fostering the age of agency, which I think is a fascinating idea. But maybe you get there on this question a bit. How do you think we can better integrate families and communities as active partners in the educational process?
There's so much to be done here, and this is a big part of the work my colleagues at Brookings do. I do with my colleagues at Brookings, including my colleague Emily Morris, on our family school community engagement work. And one of the most important things that we found in our research, and others would support, is building relational trust with families, which takes dialogue. It takes listening. It takes dialogue. So schools are often approaching families and parents as, here's what you can do. Let me, as you're the listener, I'm the teller. So, I'll give you a small, short example. There was one of our partners in our Family Engagement Education Network that had very diverse community, public school system, the superintendent, and couldn't get people to come to back to school night. And then finally, out of desperation, they got to the point they were doing raffles for like iPads, and still nobody would show up, giving away pizza, please. And finally, out of desperation, they tried, they had this incredible guy, Mike Serban, who came in and did something totally new. He just, instead of having, the adults come in, sit in little rows in the tiny chairs and listen to what the teachers are saying your kids do, he put the chairs in a circle. And the teacher just said, what are your hopes and dreams for your kid? And they would go around a circle and talk. And that was the 45 minutes. And then the next year, everybody went back and said, oh my God, there was this incredible conversation. And all of a sudden, they've got one of the best family engagement rates of a lot of districts that I've seen in the US. So that's one piece. Another thing is, and this gets a little bit to your comment about BC, is really bring communities in the discussion of what school should be for and what it should look like and what do we want to achieve with school. We have a great case study, again, with our Family Engagement Network, of Sea to Sky District in BC, who was struggling with rates of Indigenous Indigenous student graduation. I think it was very low, 50,
As
30.
it is across the country.
Yeah, compared to 80% of white kids. And they threw everything at it, new curriculum, teacher PD, all sorts of things. Finally, they brought in the tribal leaders. They just had a year of listening with and dialogue, Indigenous leaders, educators, school leaders, all community members, and really came up with a new vision that that included a new vision of what makes for a good human being. And it made a huge difference. Like both the non-Indigenous kids' graduation rates went up, and the Indigenous kids, after several years, their graduation rates, they all went into the 90 percentile. And they still have a lot of work to do, but it's really about bringing communities in as a partner in envisioning the purpose of education.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know the superintendent there, Chris Nicholson, great guy. So I'm sure he's been deeply involved in that work. And not only a shout out to Chris, but a lot of the folks in BC and Ontario, and I know across Canada, are really focusing on that. And again, so much to discuss here because I think there's a great model that Canada has that can be exported to the States. To help with all kinds of these kind of conversations, and the work that schools are doing now with Indigenous communities is certainly one of them. So thank you for highlighting that. Rebecca, I can really spend another few hours. We didn't even touch AI, which I really wanted to do.
Can you believe it? Next time
we'll dive in a bit more. But I do love this question, and maybe you can bring AI into this question. But if you had a magic wand, and now I have to emphasize, this is the all-powerful magic wand.
You could do anything.
Can wish away borders. You can do whatever you want. If you had a magic wand, what would you do to change the education system?
So many things are going through my head right now, Jason, because I'm trying to pick one. And like, is there,
you don't have to
is there
one.
One that could multiply? Yeah, could I?
You're
sandwich?
All powerful.
I think the thing that I would do the most would be, to really find a way to shift to competency-based, mastery-based learning progression, and to bring the walls of the school down a bit so that there's a much broader learning ecosystem that young people are immersed in, where they're learning certain things with direct instruction and knowledge development, which is absolutely essential, and applying it in different places around the city. And that there's just a much, which it can include, by the way, a lot of family input, cultural backgrounds and stories and, experiences. So it's a much more embedded experience being a young person, rather than you're here in your family and your community embedded in your life, and then you go to this one place where you learn and then you leave.
That's a wonderful, wonderful vision. Our last question always is, what book, podcast, video, movie, album, anything you want, all the above, one of them, two of them, whatever you'd like, what would you recommend to the audience besides your marvelous book, which I will have talked about in the introduction?
Okay, well, I just finished a novel that I absolutely loved called Everything by Nicola Yoon, which I highly recommend. It's fast read, great read. And the podcast I just listened to, I just wrote I have a LinkedIn newsletter, and I just wrote a newsletter on this, and it stuck with me so much, is Reid Hoffman's Master of Scale podcast, where he is interviewing, God, what is his name? The CEO of, some toy company, but who they are talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And everything they talk about in terms of Dungeons and Dragons is about agentic and engaged student learning experiences. Because both of them played Dungeons and Dragons growing up and are currently playing it. And then he went on and talked about how he's using AI, how AI can be used to scale it. Anyways, I just found it fascinating.
Excellent. I will dig that up, and I will make sure it's all linked for everyone.
I will send you the newsletter.
Awesome.
You can add it in the show notes.
Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. I'm really honored that you took the time to be part of the podcast. Thank you.
It was a total pleasure, Jason. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bukhari. Until next time.